Welcome to the Thinklings podcast, a conversation where good thoughts help renew the mind with the Word of God. I'm Charlie Carter, and I'm here with Tim Little and Andy Stearns. Let's jump into the conversation.
Welcome to the Thinklings podcast. My name is Tim Little, and I have a very deep voice today because I am recovering from a cold. So,
Tim, wow.
How are you guys doing?
I feel ashamed of having such a high voice next to you. Man, you are in the cellar today, buddy.
I am. What can I do about it? I thought about maybe I should try to make up my real voice, but it just wasn't working.
You should quit smoking.
Oh my word.
This is wise advice. We shot some fireworks off just the other day. There was a lot of smoke.
Oh, hold on. Guys, like a couple episodes ago, like last week, I asked you, what's your favorite firework? Did you guys shoot off fireworks last week?
I like the mortars.
Oh, did you get the big ones?
They're 5-inch mortars. They were pretty big. It was fun.
Okay.
My dad bought them.
I was going to say, we went to a fireworks tent on the way to my parents' house. We didn't stay all day, and we came home and did it, but I've never bought like a big pile of fireworks because it wasn't legal. So I got one big Roman candle thing and some spinners. I spent like $25, but man, some of those mortars, like one mortar was $25, and I'm sure the bigger ones were even more.
It was like a pack of them. So it wasn't too bad. But it was a lot of fun.
Charlie, fireworks?
Nope. I think we had enough of it just independently around Ankeny. I didn't really need to do much. There's plenty of explosions.
I know some people who just go and camp out on the roof of their house in Ankeny, and they get quite a show just doing that.
Yep, there was plenty of stuff getting shot off around my apartment complex, even though there are signs clearly posted that say no fireworks. There were lots of fireworks.
I saw a video clip 4 years or 2020. Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, tried to ban fireworks. Do you see that clip? And it was like all the people in LA just blowing off the fireworks.
Yeah, it didn't work.
Our neighborhood was quite loud too, Charlie. The kids were in bed, but I just walked the streets and got videos, and it was pretty intense. It was awesome, but pretty intense. You're up on a higher floor though, so you probably have a better vantage point. That'd be pretty. Can you see the Summerfest fireworks from your side of the building, or are you on the other side?
Nope. Yep, I can because I'm facing that direction. So
wow, that'd be really nice.
Mm-hmm.
So how are you guys doing, Charlie? What's been going on?
So I think the last episode. So we actually timed this kind of well, which is impressive because we don't really think about it that much. But the last episode last week, we talked about how I was going to be going on a camping trip, and it's now been a couple of weeks since I've been back. But so I spent a full week on a backpacking trip, and we spent one night in Nebraska, which was what you would expect of Nebraska, and then
I re-listened to that episode recently. We were pretty harsh to Nebraska. Sorry, Nebraska. We do love the people there.
You guys are horrendous.
2 weeks from today, I will be in Nebraska again at a camp. So looking forward to that at Whispering Cedars. But and then did
anybody get eaten by a mountain lion?
Well, it's funny you should say that. So we did have a couple of encounters, and I don't know if I'm supposed to say this or not. We didn't tell anyone about it, but the first night we were in Wyoming, I woke up in the middle of the night, and it's something when someone is used to the outdoors and hunts, there's like a different sense of like the sounds that are happening. And I could hear something walking through our camp, and I could hear it breathing. And I'm fairly confident that it was a bear just roaming through at like 2 a.m.
Nice.
And so
I don't want to go camping and backpacking now. It's okay.
Well, it is what it is. Like they're there because they smell food, and as long as you don't have food in your tent, you're going to be fine. That's not that's a huge generalization, but so I heard this thing kind of breathing, and you can imagine what a 200-300 pound bear breathes like, but I can hear this, and I can
Like
hear
Tim when
it.
he's sick.
Yeah, Tim early in the morning a little bit.
You
Yeah.
guys are horrendous.
And oh, that's funny.
That was a good one.
But so once I had kind of heard it progress through our camp, I woke up Sawyer. We kind of did a little bit of a sweep, and we were all good. But that was like actually at a campground in Wyoming. That next day is when the guys went and we backpacked in. I think it was about a 2 mile or so hike. And we were back in the middle of nowhere for like 3 or 4 days. And we had a handful of more interactions with wildlife. And so we caught a bunch of fish the first morning we were there, and we roasted them over the fire and attracted a bear. And
oh wow.
but we had already kind of disbanded our little cooking area. And there's just me and a couple of guys, Garrett and Mason, and we were walking up the hill to our tents, and I caught something out of the corner of my eye, and I was like, "Oh, hey guys, hold up!" And they reacted how you would expect teenagers to react, which is not listening to what I had just told them to do. and so they like run towards this unidentified object, and it was also a black bear. And I started yelling. Like you're supposed to, like, you don't want to startle the bear, you want to like let it hear you and know that you're there. And so I just started saying, hey bear, hey bear. And all the other guys are like, oh, hey, a bear. And like that's not the tone that's supposed to have. It's supposed to be like, don't come running and looking for this thing.
Uh-huh.
And this will come to my shout out to one of our favorite Thinklings listeners, Seth Bennett, who's a Thinklings listener. I think a handful of those guys, and in that youth group that I was with, I think a handful of people listen or have listened to our podcast. But I think Seth is the top dog there as far as Thinklings listener. And so there's a thing when you're backpacking, you're giving up certain amenities while you're camping. And so there are no toilets. Okay.
Yep.
So Seth is back in the woods. The term that we would use for this is flipping a rock. But he's taking care of business as this bear is like lumbering through. And I think probably one of the funnier moments was that moment of recognition and panic of like, where is Seth? Oh, he's out there. And like this bear was probably pretty close to him. It wasn't like coming to him. It wasn't like hunting him down or anything. Right. But our group had a little bit of a fun with that. Like, Seth is fighting off bears while he's going to the bathroom. And but so it was a really good trip that way. Just a lot of fun, a lot of time. Like, you don't have any modern life. Like you are out on a mountain, no cell reception. Like you're just, it takes you 10 times longer to do anything. And it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. It was difficult enough that we didn't just like fall in love with it. Like I don't want to romanticize it in a sense. Like it wasn't all rainbows and Christmas, but it wasn't so bad that I would not do it again.
Did anybody have a firearm?
A couple of us did.
Oh,
yes.
Well, you're in the middle of the woods.
Yeah, there was. So, and then I'll get to so probably the epitome of that trip was, I think everything came to a T on the last night, where I have a unique little teepee where it's lightweight and it has a foldable stove that you can construct, has a stovepipe in the top. So if it's like really cold, you can start a fire in the
You have
teepee.
seriously? Those are
Oh, yeah.
awesome. Like I've watched
Yeah.
like camping videos with those.
So
That's amazing.
if you go to Google and search Seek, SEEK, Seek outside, that's the teepee I have. And it's awesome because it's very lightweight and durable. And so that last night it was pretty cold. And so we had our stove, we lit that stove up, but the stove pipe, the little flue got clogged. And so we woke up in the middle of the night and we were like smoking ourselves out. Like it was our teepee, it was full of smoke. And so that's where the night began. It was like 1:00 in the morning, and it was me trying not to burn my hands, throwing the stove out of the teepee. And
Wow.
so that's like 1:00, and it is cold. And so Sawyer, I look at him and I'm like, we're just gonna freeze for the next like 4 hours until the sun comes up. Okay. So then it's like 2 in the morning and I wake up again. And I can hear something walking around our teepee. And I don't know what it is. Obviously, you can't see anything. It's like pitch black, but I can hear these light footsteps, like literally, like right outside. I hear it walking around and I can hear it breathing, but it's a very different, it's not what I would consider to be like that bear from the first night, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And it's so cold. I'm like, you know what? I'm not going to do anything unless it comes in this teepee or I hear a kid scream. And so I had the revolver. I'm holding it and I'm just laying there and listening. And I hear it walk through. I hear it kind of circle around, walk through, and kind of just go off to the side. And then I eventually, I just fall asleep. And the next morning, we're not really thinking much of it. As we're tearing down the teepee, another guy we were with notices this track outside of our teepee, like, and I mean right outside. So like Sawyer and I were sleeping on opposite sides, and this would be where his head is at in the corner of that teepee. This track is less than a foot away from where his head was.
What?
And it is, I don't know this. I haven't verified it. I haven't sent it to any like professional, but it looks like an almost perfect mountain lion track.
Oh my.
It's got like the 4 toes and a big pad in the middle. And so you can just imagine, like, because a mountain lion is pretty light on their feet, but I can imagine this mountain lion in the middle of the night coming down and he's like leaning up and he's like smelling the corner of that teepee. And he's like, he knows something's in there and they don't know what teepees are, but he's like, where is this thing at that I'm smelling? And he's like right up to the edge. And it's just like that next morning we have this revelation that like this critter was like, inches from you and you didn't even know it was there.
Is giving Sawyer a kiss.
Yeah. And like had it decided to take some action, we had weaponry, but that's definitely the mountain lion's home field advantage for sure. But so we got a nice full dose of wildlife and hiking and mountain. And we were incredibly stinky when we left. And yeah, but it was a great trip. And I might share in a devotional in a future episode kind of my big takeaways from that. But that was a great trip. So yeah, sorry to take a long time talking about it, but that's kind of the biggest update of my summer, other than just the normal ins and outs of preparing for camp ministry and things like that.
That's really cool.
The mountain lion on that.
The mountain lion being right there and you not knowing it kind of makes me think of who knows what the Lord orchestrates in our lives. We just have no idea. You know what I'm saying? Like, you've heard of people who have like dangerous experiences like that. And you just wonder, like, man, one day are we going to find out some fun things when we are with the Lord, the way he's preserved us and taking care of us at times.
Right.
That's cool. Well, we are in the Stearns household. Robin has had her surgery. She's had her second week update checkup. And basically she's in a like try to get strong phase before we go back for some more scans in about 2 weeks. When we go back, that'll determine what's in the future for us. So listeners, feel free to pray for the Stearns household. For sure, radiation. They're going to do radiation on her leg where the tumor was because they want to try to make sure they get absolutely every cell. This is a very aggressive cancer, we found out. And so if there's anything left, it's going to regrow. But then our doctors are doing some tests to see if there's any other treatments that would work. The chemo like only killed 22% of the tumor last time, and it was the best concoction for this kind of tumor. So yeah, so we're just kind of in a waiting phase. It's been kind of nice in one way because Robin's really far away from, like, 8 to 10 weeks away from her chemo, so her stomach is not nearly as upset. She can eat a little bit. She still can't eat a lot of foods, but she can eat much more foods, and her hair is starting to grow back, which there will probably be more chemo in the future, so that'll fall out. But the kids, however, Evan did the basketball camp that was on Faith's campus a week or two ago. Oh man, the Hoop Stars, he just thought it was great. And Charlie, you said when you left that camping trip, you guys were really stinky. I'm telling you, these these are 4th and 5th grade boys. One day, Coach Fincham, apparently, this is through my son, he's like, Coach was there and he looked down at us, and I don't know what precipitated this, but Fincham just said, man, you guys smell really good today. And I can just hear the sarcasm in Brian Fincham's voice.
Yeah.
So, but yeah. Hey, I want to give a shout out to Camp Utibica today. We have 2 people from Tim and I's church who are out there. So Stephen and Christina, I hope you're having a good summer. We're glad you're out there. Glad you're serving the Lord. It's been really encouraging. Tim and I we do the Wednesday night kids ministry during the school year. And so I never get to go to prayer meeting. Neither does Tim. And so this summer, because I'm not doing travel because of our life, I've been in prayer meeting more consistently. And it's been cool to hear about, there's a line in the prayer list for all the people in ministry. And we really have a lot of college students, like all over the country this year, working in camps and various ministries. So one of them's going to Romania for like a 6-week internship kind of a thing, or a 6-week missions trip. It's been cool. So shout out to Camp Utibica. A couple weeks ago, we talked about Saturnalia. You guys remember that talk?
Yes.
It was a good time, wasn't it? So we had a listener message us.
It wasn't too good of a time, though.
It was what? Oh yeah,
an appropriate amount of goodness.
No one would have called our podcast a modern day Saturnalia.
Right.
So
a Thinklings festival.
That would be a lot of books and a lot of coffee. So for a longtime listener, Daniel of the Forest, we'll just say Daniel of the Forest. He wrote in and said at the very end of my talk on Saturnalia, I said I was writing that for the chapter, and I gave the analogy of July 4th. I said, what if it became like this holiday Christians co-opted into being like the freedom in Christ holiday, and in the future, it was only that. And then someone said, hey, that's just a pagan holiday. I said, maybe that's similar. I said, maybe there's a better parallel. So this is what he says. He says, I have a thought on Saturnalia, July 4th analogy, after listening to your episode. I don't think it's strong enough to include as an option because it's an identical scenario except for the most significant parts to a Christian concerned about Christmas. July 4th isn't a pagan holiday, and I do think I would agree right there. I'll just stop reading the quote. It's currently not pagan. It's just a national holiday. It doesn't celebrate any paganism. So I agree. That's the weak part of that analogy. He says, and Christians aren't borrowing it questionably. So there's nothing questionable that we're using, like in my magical analogy. He says the national conflicts between Great Britain and its colonies 250 years ago are almost meaningless now from the spiritual vantage point. while paganism remains permanently opposed to God. So I do agree. I think that's a perceptive comment, Daniel of the Forest. I will say this though, in the chapter that I wrote and submitted, I actually used a different illustration, and I didn't want to use it on the podcast because I was still developing it. But I'll just say that I used Pride Month in the book, and so I think that analogy definitely might be a little better. So, but we'll see. We'll see when the editor reads it if she thinks that too, and if not, then I might be calling you for a new illustration. So,
yeah,
Tim, what are you doing these days?
Right now, I'm in New York visiting my family. A couple of weeks ago, I was at Raccoon River Bible Camp. Had a great time with the 4th through 6th graders. Maybe it was 3rd through 6th graders. Anyway, the younger kids.
The pictures on Facebook looked awesome.
Yeah, we had a really good time. I did a series through the life of Abraham and talked about belief. Genesis 12, 13, 14, 15, and then jumped to chapter 22 at the end. But we had a really good time. And I just love going and ministering with younger kids. They're very formable at that time in their lives. And so, Raccoon River is a really different camp. They really emphasize scripture memory, which I really love. Kids were memorizing a lot of verses.
That's really good.
Yeah, it was a good time. And that's kind of what's been going on in my life. I've been working on an article, which I have to have done by the beginning of August, but I haven't touched that in about 2 or 3 weeks. So when I get back to Ankeny, that's going to be a major focus for the rest of my summer. So we have some Thinklings business to tend to.
Books and business.
Yeah, I didn't know who was saying it, Charlie.
I didn't mess it up this time.
That's true. Tim got it right, everybody. Tim figured it out, and me and Charlie messed it up.
We don't have a plan. There's not a plan. You can't mess something up if there's not a plan.
I thought we had the plan. I thought we did have a plan.
We did have a plan.
You guys are horrendous. Okay, who's got the book?
So I've been reading a book, and this is going to be a shout out to honorary Thinkling Josh Boyd. He messaged me earlier in the summer and said, "Hey, have you read Francis Schaeffer's A Christian Manifesto?" And I said, "No, it's on my reading list. I'd like to one day." I'm a Schaeffer fan. He's an apologetic guy, and he's a philosopher, and all that stuff's interesting to me. And so Josh said, "Well, I'm reading it right now for a project, and I'm finding it very interesting." Anyways, and so I wrote back and said, "Hey, I'll read it, and why don't you keep me posted on your progress?" And then he just burned me, because 2 years ago we were going to read a book together in the summer, and I set up a schedule online, and then I literally didn't read any of the book, and he's never let me forget it. Oh, I know, he's never let me forget it. He just digs at me every time with it.
What a good friend.
It is. It really is a good friend. Like when you say you're going to read a book and you literally don't read any of it until one chapter at the end of the summer, it's worth getting ripped up over. So this time I thought I'm going to read it. And what I have found is that I am able to carve time out to read, which is good. And I've been working on some projects. So I'm pleased. Normally in the summer, especially like right now with what's going on, I didn't know if I'd be able to get anything done, but I've been able to do a little bit and spend a lot of time with my kids and my family. But I have worked through almost the entire book. And so I think I'm ready to talk about it a little. There are 10 chapters and I've read 7. But I think listeners, this would be interesting. So I wished I hadn't told you the title, and I wished I hadn't told these guys the title, and I had just talked about the topics, because you wouldn't know that this book was written back in like the 60s or 70s. It's very, I think the term is prescient, like forward sight. It can see what's going on. So listener, if you're interested in this, I'm going to give you an overview of it. Chapter 1 and chapter 2 really talk about the themes of how do you know what you know, like what's true, and then where do you base your where you found the idea of freedom, and then your belief. And he's going to come off a lot like a presuppositionalist or a reformed. He's reformed. So there's going to be a lot of starting with like the Bible and what does the Bible say. It's not that he discounts anything out in the world that you can observe. It's not that way. He really is. Kokol once on our podcast, and maybe it was we were talking with him afterwards. I thought Schaeffer was a presuppositionalist, and he said, I think he's an evidentialist who's sensitive to presuppositions. And I think both cases could be made. But in the book, he really does start off saying, this is God's world. This is God's world. You have to either recognize that and submit to it or rebel. And so I like that. So he talks about that. And the whole reason he's talking about this topic is because he's responding to some other manifestos. Now, if I say Christian manifesto to you guys, are there any other manifestos that you can think of?
So the first manifesto that I think of, probably the more popular manifesto, the Communist Manifesto.
Mm-hmm. And that's the first one Schaeffer's responding to. What's
And
your
the other
one?
one, which I think is more of an American anomaly, is the Unabomber Manifesto.
So that was, okay, I wondered. That's the only one I knew about growing up, because the Unabomber had that manifesto.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd never heard of the Communist Manifesto, and yet I was public schooled. Interesting. So Schaeffer's actually responding to 3 manifestos. One that you mentioned, he's not responding to Unabomber because that's not yet historically, and nor is it that.
Hadn't happened yet.
Yeah. The other 2, Tim, do you have any manifestos? So there's the Humanist Manifesto 1 and Humanist Manifesto 2. And those are, they're not they sort of go the same direction. I don't know. I haven't read them, but they're kind of in the same vein, I would say.
Same vein as the Communist Manifesto?
Yeah. So the Communist Manifesto is written by, Marx and the social communists at the time. And this is like, 1920s, 10s, 30s, somewhere around there. It's pretty early. The Humanist Manifestos are written much later, and they are written by people who are atheists and then want to have like a humanist philosophy for life, where it's like you kind of focus on humans, maybe is the way you could think about it. I've not read either of them. It's on my list. I want to read the full Communist Manifesto. I want to read all the Humanist Manifestos. So when this book opens up, starting on those topics, I'm immediately like, oh man, this is interesting. And so he's going through, what are your foundations for truth? And then like, what's freedom? And then he turns to where all that's falling apart in our culture. And he's writing this in the 70s, but honestly, his critiques are really good, and they would fit today. You would read this and think, that's good. That's right. And then he turns and it gets really interesting. So I didn't realize, I think he was in the moral majority back in he wrote this in 81. Sorry, he wrote this in 81. I think I remember that now. I think he was a part of the moral majority of the 80s, where like Jerry Falwell and all them were trying to like get enough of the conservatives together that we can kind of run the country. And so this is very interesting. So he's reformed, and I don't know what his eschatology is, but I wouldn't be surprised if he had kind of a post-mill or an a-mill kind of a flavor. I don't think he didn't seem pre-mill to me. He didn't seem like, even not dispensational at all. I'm just saying historic pre-mill. But where he's going is, what do you do? In his chapter 5 on revival, revolution, and reform, he goes through those 3 topics and mentions this. He says, in the Protestant Reformation, there are countries that have long-lasting change, like from the Reformation going forward. And then there are countries who have the Reformation come to it, and then they don't have long-lasting change. And he says the difference is that the countries that had long-lasting change took Reformation principles and pushed them into the body politic of the country, and even to the point where there were like fighting and rebellion going on over it. And when like the Reformation got sort of ensconced in the culture, then it actually had a long-lasting change. But in the countries where the Reformation came, and then it sort of like they didn't do any of that politics stuff, the other side, the Catholics or whatever, would just squash them, and then long term there was no like long-term fruit. Now, do you see where he's going with this? Are you taking the 2 and the 2 and adding it in 4? He's I think making a case, and I have not read the last 3 chapters. I think he's making a case for some civil disobedience and maybe rebellion. There's chapter 6 is an open window. That's what it's called. And what he's saying is, in different cultures, there are times where the culture will be more open to Christianity and Christian influence. And I would just say, like today, in China, if I mention that I'm a Christian and I start trying to do stuff, I get put in jail. But in America, I can mention I'm a Christian, I'll just get canceled. Now, 50 or 100 years ago, I could mention I'm a Christian and no big deal. That's fine. And what he's saying is our window is closing in this country where we're going to lose our ability to have influence. And so we got to make the most of it. Now, he's writing this in 1981.
Yeah.
That's 42 years ago. I'm 43. That's like my whole lifetime. Now, look at our country today. That's the thing about this book. He's like a prophet. We are losing all the possible influence we could have. Now, here's where it's getting interesting, and I don't know where he's going. I'm reading the chapter 7 called The Limits of Civil Disobedience.
Civil obedience.
And he's what?
The limits of civil obedience?
Obedience, sorry. Yeah, the limits of civil obedience. So as a person in the city, the city, what should you obey? And he's laying out a shockingly interesting case, a lot like from the Bible, on his view of how Christians should obey politics. So this makes sense. I think he's just applying it in a way I hadn't thought of. So he starts off in Romans 13, of course, and the one other government passage, maybe it's in Peter. Yeah, it's 1 Peter 2 and 3. And he says, look, what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to submit to the government because God ordained government to punish evil and reward good. He says, but what if the government does something wicked? Well, we would all say you don't obey it. But I think his whole chapter is just fleshing out what that looks like and where the disobedience is coming from. Now, remember, he has the heavy Reformed emphasis, so he's taking a strong view of God's lordship, which I think is a good thing. But he's saying if the government is not submitting to the lordship of Christ, it's actually a false, I don't know what term he uses, it's a wrong government. And it's right for us to like flip it and put in a good government. Now, you see where this is going to fit very well with like the Doug Wilson Christian nationalism theonomy.
Yeah.
But also, like, biblically, it was starting to kind of make sense. I think Schaeffer is putting all his eggs in the basket of culture and wanting to change the culture. I'm not sure I'm ready to do that yet, but it was a really interesting case. Now, I haven't read chapter 8. That's titled The Use of Civil Disobedience. Chapter 9 is titled The Use of Force. And chapter 10 is By Teaching, By Life, By Action. I haven't read those, and I'm curious where he's going to go. But it's not what I expected, but I haven't read any of the other 3 manifestos. Oh, actually, I haven't read the Unabomber manifesto either, so I haven't ever read a manifesto. I thought this would be more like the Nashville Declaration or the Manhattan Declaration. I thought it was going to be something like that with affirmations and denials. But it's more of like a really long monograph on one topic where he's like trying to build an argument. So it's like a normal book. But I would say it was really interesting, and I'm not ready to rank it, but I think it would be interesting to read. If you're into politics, you'd probably find this book interesting. I don't know that I want to say, hey, this is how to do it yet. But I'm totally intrigued. I would just say that. Totally intrigued. So shout out to Josh Boyd for a good recommendation. He also then said, have you read How Shall We Then Live? And I have. I really liked that. I really liked that a lot. So I think, did I say his name wrong, Charlie? It's not Josh Boyd, right?
No. It's the other name.
What was the other name?
Dr. Puddleglum?
I thought you were going to say friend of the podcast.
Which, in light of mentioning it, I have a Puddleglum quote.
Ooh, give us a Puddleglum quote.
Life isn't all fricasseed frogs and eel pie. And if you're wondering what a fricassee is, it's like a stew. And so life isn't all stewed frogs and eel pie.
That should be, Charlie, that should be when like you're with some teens and life's going bad And you want to be like, hey, life's not a party. You should be like, hey, life's not fricasseed frogs and eel pie. And I just think the looks you would get from those. So,
Well, I love it too. Here's Puddle Glum, whose name, his name, I don't know if there's a specific title for characters whose name reveals their character. It's like Puddle Glum. And he's over here like, well, you can't have eel pie every day, guys. Like, it's so funny. Anyway, we are going to look into the word for a moment here, but I have an agenda with it. So if anyone's listening to this who was at junior high camp at IRBC in July, we had this discussion in chapel on Friday. And so as we're recording this, next Friday up at IRBC, we are going to have a springboard. So that's students going into their freshman year of high school. We're having a springboard conversation about worldviews. And so I'm having a little discussion on worldviews. And we did joke, this is usually the assignment that Andy gets. And so this quite truthfully, this is a little bit out of my expertise, so if someone wanted me to talk about discipleship or talk about, Owen Barfield's writings, and the Inklings and, obscure quotes of Gandalf, like that's my expertise. I'm not like as versed in the worldview discussion, definition, and history. And so it was actually probably good for me to review some of those things. And so a friend of the podcast, Greg Kokel, has a wonderful book, The Story of Reality, which I do think he, in a narratival, very discussion, conversation form, has a nice book about thinking through what worldviews are. And then we've talked about James Sire before on the podcast. And so I was just reviewing some of those resources. And so I have a little bit of a document put together here. And it's going to be like a kind of a prime the pump, if you will, and then we'll look at a couple of verses. And so as I read through this, Andy and Tim, I would love any feedback because I haven't had the discussion yet. So if you think there's things that I should emphasize or de-emphasize or manipulate, let me know. So here is what I defined as a worldview, and unashamedly, I got these things from Greg Kokel. A worldview is just what the word says. It's a, quote, view of the world. We give the name worldview to a specific perspective on life and reality. A great way of thinking about worldviews is to compare them to the pictures on the top of puzzle boxes. The big picture on the box helps you make sense of the individual pieces as you try to fit the puzzle together. Some worldviews have similar pieces to each other, but many differ in significant ways. The most significant pieces of any worldview answer these following questions. Where did we come from, and or who or what created us? So there's a creation question. Number two, what are we? So specifically, what is humanity? Trying to get there to like, what is our reality? Like, are we animals? Are we more than animals? And it kind of bridges into like a materialism or matterism discussion is what Kokel does. Number three, what is wrong with the world or the universe, if anything? So is this just perfect creation, or is there something wrong with our world? And then number four, will the world or the universe ever be fixed? And if so, by whom? And so that's really the four questions that our discussion, that's the devotion that the campers are going to go through. And we have some Bible passages to help them think through those four questions. So they'll do the devotional where they're thinking about worldview. And then we're going to have like a 30 to 40 minute discussion where we're going to walk through those points. And I did think it was very important to make sure every point came from the Word of God, because I do think we can kind of devolve in a discussion that is very philosophical. And I could quote guys, but I think it was better to quote, just have like verses for them. And so every point I make, so the creator created, obviously, Genesis 1, and the creator is a personal being. And I really like the way Kokol discusses this, where if he makes a personal being, so he creates us in his image. So we're like him. That means that he is a personal being because he created a personal being. And so Genesis 1:27, being made in the image of man, and that creator knows things and he communicates what he knows, and that is revelation. And so Psalm 19, he's revealed things to us. And then as a created being, we have to realize that we belong to the creator. And so I love 1 Corinthians 6, you are not your own. We are not our own. We don't have our own life. And created beings have designed limitations. God made us this way. And I love whenever I speak to just appeal to, well, look what Jesus did. Jesus slept and Jesus ate. Like, humans have those physical limitations to them, and that is a part of being created by him. So just as if I was to ignore eating, I would have physical problems. Well, if I'm also a spiritual being and I ignore spiritual needs, I will have problems. And that's kind of what gets into that, what was meant to be more practical discussion there, where he tells us to number our days. We need to take life seriously and soberly and understand what life is as a created being, and that the beginning of living wisely in this reality is to fear the Lord. And so that opens up the door for a really nice discussion where we eventually land in what is practical living for the Christian. We do not want to continue to live in arrogance or ignorance to the word of God, but we want to understand that we have a daily battle to engage in, and that is the war of the flesh and the spirit, and that has real consequences to it. It's a part of ministering to other people, sharing what is true to other people, and then experiencing the life, the good life that God intends for us. Comes down to living in those real physical limitations, and learning to live with those real spiritual admonishments. And so, really, what I'm going to have them write down at the end of the discussion, and this is a kind of a clashing of a couple of ideas, but matter doesn't matter. I think that is a really good summary for what I want them to take away, is that there are worldviews that think that we're just physical, that it's just matter, it's just things. And those worldviews also really struggle to figure out what joy is. Because if it is only physical, then joy must come from, or happiness must come from, physical. And so we'll probably talk about this in another podcast. But one of the things I really love about Tim's book, Song of Songs for Singles, which I didn't mention this earlier, but when we were off air, but whenever I've talked about this book with people, I'm like, yeah, guess what? I'm the single. So like, you have a title, Song for Singles. I'm like, yeah, that's me. Anyway, but so Tim, you say this in the opening chapters of your book. It might be the very first chapter. Sex just doesn't matter that much. You say that a lot. You emphasize that. And you also emphasize that our culture doesn't believe that. They want to make it a much bigger deal than it is. And so you think about, like, what does matter? Like, what brings joy and happiness? And this is a fundamental worldview question. Does physical life provide the source of real joy? And it does not. And so that's really I think the takeaway that I want to present to these kids is matter doesn't really matter that much. Yeah, we live here, we have to understand it, but the real joy of life is understanding and walking wisely in light of who God is. That's a spiritual reality and a practical spiritual life. What do you guys think about those 4 questions? Did I capture what worldviews are? Am I missing something?
I think those are really good questions. And in fact, I'm trying to remember who it is. I think it's Sire, but I think there's more. Ken Samples has, I think it's Ken Samples. There's a couple of people who have, Ron Nash. Ron Nash has a bunch of these. But the questions you ask a worldview help to show if the worldview can actually account for reality, because every worldview is saying it's an accounting of reality. So I like those questions. I would say this, listener, you're probably hearing those and thinking, who says I'm going to build a worldview and make sure I can answer all these questions? I don't think that's how it works. But everyone has to answer those questions. Like no one can't not answer those.
Well,
So once you get to that point, it's really like, man, I got to answer these questions no matter who you are.
well, would you say that every human being presupposes an answer to those questions, whether they realize it or not?
I think that, yes.
Yeah. It's almost like they have an answer, whether they know they have an answer or not.
The other thing you could, so remember our friend, not friend, remember the thinker Blaise Pascal.
Mhm.
He did he's famous for the wager. We should talk about the wager sometime. I think I can helpfully explain the wager to our listeners because it gets a bad rap. But here's one thing that he thought. He was into statistics, and he kind of looked at things from percentages. And in the question of does God exist or not, he realized very perceptively that that's a yes or no answer. There's no spectrum.
Yep.
It's not like and so I think all the questions you just answered, they're not all exactly yes no answers. But Pascal's really interesting perception was that even if you say you don't know the answer, you have to answer that to live in a certain way. So how you live at least answers it. And Charlie, I think all the questions you have right there, even if you say I don't know what the answer is, you have to live an answer to those questions. Like, who created us? Well, I don't know. Well, you're either going to live like a God created you, or you're going to live like you're not created by a God and you can do
Yep.
what you want. I don't know. I like that. That's good. And
So,
the puzzle box illustration.
And that's straight from Greg Koukl.
Yep.
And so the way that he tells the story of reality is he says, I think he has 5 main points to it: God, man, fall. I don't know if he calls it fall, but maybe curse. And then I can't remember what he says for Jesus, if it's like savior, but then his last one is like resurrection, and it's like final resurrection, like things are fixed resurrection. And so in that book, he just walks through that story of it, but he weaves really well in other elements of other worldviews. And so really what the heart of the discussion is going to try to get to is I really focus on reality, the term reality. What is real? And
That's
so
good.
that first little bit I read is the devotional that they'll go through. And I asked them to go to Acts 17 with Paul on the Areopagus and read through that passage and answer those questions. So, based on Acts 17, where did we come from? And it's very clear God created us. And is there a problem with the world? Very clear. There is sin. And what is the answer to that? And so they'll work through those. And then there's a couple other passages I threw in there that talk about like human wisdom versus spiritual wisdom and things like that. So 1 Corinthians 2, the natural man discussion, the human wisdom versus the wisdom of the spirit. Romans 12 very specifically says, do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed through the renewing of your mind. So there's an easy dichotomy there when we consider, here's one way of living in the world and another way. And then Ephesians 2, where it just says, we were dead like the rest of the world. And so like recognizing these are like very all-encompassing statements of there's a worldly wisdom that we should not conform to because it is spiritually dead. And then that opens the door, I think, for the positive side of worldview, which is to see reality as God made it, where we are not just human physical beings, we're spiritual beings. And so here are the bullet points of the discussion we're going to have, and I'll see what you guys think of them. So again, the repetition of the term is realities. So trying to make worldviews practical. Number one, the reality of the creator. Number two, the realities of created beings and created entities. So if there's a creator, there has to be created things. And so that's the first two natural steps of worldview is there is a creator, which means we're the created. And then number three, the practical realities of physical and spiritual life. So we are physical, we are spiritual, and we have limitations on each of those parts of our being. And then number four, the reality of life after death. And so talking about future restoration and judgment, and then a future destination. And that includes a positive and a negative. So there is judgment. Some will be resurrected to eternal punishment, some to reward and eternal life. So those are kind of the 4 points. And then we kind of just walk through a whole dearth of passages that discuss those things. And so what do you guys think about that? And Tim, just so you know, Tim, you're going to love this. So I do have Ecclesiastes mentioned. So when we talk about the practical reality of physical life, guess what? What is real? Life under the sun is difficult. That is the reality that we live in, and you cannot avoid it. Unless you think that your wisdom or your wealth will help you avoid it, you need to go read Ecclesiastes. So got a nice little plug in there. So yeah, what do you guys think about those 4 points, or would you emphasize one thing over another thing?
Is it the practical realities of spiritual life or physical life?
Yes.
It's both.
Well, I'm focusing on the phrase like life under the sun. So like to live on earth, like to be a created being here, it's a physical reality that life on the cursed world is difficult.
Mhm.
But obviously that has a lot of spiritual ramifications to its understanding. And so that's the true roots of contentment, is recognizing that this is just how life is. And so we'll talk about that, but that's the problem. It's a very topical discussion where we're just kind of hitting some high points, and so we're not really ever going to get to focus on any detail. So, which is a shame.
So is it I don't know if you need the word practical at the beginning. Just make it the reality of
Mm,
living in the life in this world, the reality of physical life. It would create greater symmetry. My 2
sure.
cents.
So the nice thing is, so their notes are going to have that, but I'll just strike it from my own. I'll tell them. I'll be like, hey, take your pen and cross off the word practical, because
That's the best. When you're speaking
Guess
at
what?
camp and you've sent your notes the week before because you want to make sure the office manager has them in time, because you don't want to upset the office manager, because that would be bad.
So I'll tell you this. So they have a different speaker for Springboard each morning. And Greg Gosnell, a friend of the podcast, Thinklings listener, Greg, is the one organizing the junior high camp stuff. And so he's the one that invited certain people. And there were 2 people who did not turn in the notes by the prescribed deadline.
Oh, no.
Guess which 2 people did not turn in the notes by the
No.
prescribed deadline?
I'm not going to guess.
I'm not going to guess. I'm not going to.
So we got 4 points. The reality of the
I'll say
creator.
they or we share something in common.
The reality of created beings.
You just skip it past it. No, I want you to guess. You got to guess.
I'm not
And
going
one
to
of
guess.
One of
I
them's
have no
really
idea.
easy.
Well, I think you are one of them,
I am one of them.
but I have
And
no
then
idea who the other one is.
There's another person who, like me, might come from a location that shares in a proclivity to be late on things.
Dude, I'm not picking up your hints unless
No.
the name rhymes with yogurt or something. I literally don't know.
No. So the other person was Brandon Fritz. We both got texted like,
Oh,
hey,
no
just a
way.
reminder that you guys need to turn your stuff in.
You
And
guys.
Nice.
So it's
that's
just
great. That's
two
very fitting.
two former people from Williamsburg still living in very Williamsburg ways.
Oh, that warmed my heart. Okay, I was like, where's he going with this? Oh, okay,
Anyway.
you and Fritz. That makes sense. That makes sense.
So I'll let you guys make any comments, and then I will just jump into one of those passages and talk
Sure.
about them for a moment.
I really enjoy thinking about worldview because I really do think that the idea of it is something that helps Christians. Everyone lives out like you have those 4 questions, Charlie. There's a lot of lists out there of questions that a worldview answers. And listener, you may not think, what do you mean? I've never sat here and thought about these questions. But the point is that those questions have to be answered in some way for you to live. And so I think that's always profitable, even though you're not always in the Bible when you're thinking about those things. Do you know what I'm saying? But your Bible answers those questions, whether you realize it or not. And if you don't it's not even that hard of work to think about these answers as a Christian because you've got the Bible right in front of you. But you can easily get misled by the world into thinking in wrong ways. And so I'm thankful that you're going to be able to speak, even if the junior hires don't get it on the first pass. Hopefully you're going to plant good seeds in their mind to think about that. And then I'll just say, you said reality so many times. James Sire's definition of a worldview says it's a commitment, a fundamental orientation of the heart that can be expressed as a story or in a set of presuppositions that we hold about the basic constitution of reality. And that provides the foundation on which we live and move and have our being. And even if you don't answer those questions, you're living and you're moving and you're having being all the time. So I like that. I'm excited that you get to talk about that. And man, way to go, Pastor Goose, on tapping a good guy to speak on that topic. So, but yeah, why don't you take us into one of those passages?
Share with us one final thought from God's word.
I'm just going to start reading in 1 Corinthians 2, verse 1, and then we'll read down through kind of like the 12-ish range. So 1 Corinthians 2, Paul speaking, and I, when I came to you, brothers, did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom. For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling. And my speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. There's that juxtaposition there. Yet among the mature, we do impart wisdom, although it is not wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age who are doomed to pass away. So many worldview things here. But we impart a secret and hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glory. None of the rulers of this age understood this, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. But as it is written, what no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the heart of man imagined, what God has prepared for those who love him. These things God has revealed to us through the Spirit. For the Spirit searches everything, even the depths of God. For who knows a person's thoughts except the spirit of that person, which is in him? So also no one comprehends the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. Now we have received not the spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we might understand the things freely given us by God. And we impart this in words not taught by human wisdom, but taught by the Spirit, interpreting spiritual truths to those who are spiritual. And so there's just drippings in that passage of worldview elements, like who created and who has truth. And there is a wisdom, and I think Paul would maybe put some air quotes to it, some wisdom in this world. But he clearly indicates, guys, when I came to you, I didn't speak to you in the way that the world would want me to speak. I wasn't a rhetorician. I was weak. And the message that I gave you is not the message of the wisdom of this age or the rulers of this age. I shared with you the hidden wisdom of God that is from the Spirit of God. And the reason that Paul had it is because God gave us that Spirit, and he has led us into this truth. And that is what he teaches and how he teaches when he goes places. And he juxtaposes the human worldly wisdom of the rulers of this age with the wisdom that is from above, the wisdom that is from God and from the Spirit. And it fits really well with James chapter 3 and Colossians chapter 3, seeking those things which are above, and recognizing that there is a difference between an earthly human wisdom and what it produces in our lives versus the spiritual wisdom that only comes through submission to the Lord, submission to his word and his Spirit. And that is where worldviews, I think, really do become practical. It's not, we've discussed Kokel's book Tactics, where you can strategize having a conversation with someone, knowing how to answer questions, knowing how to ask good questions about people's worldviews. And I think it can become just like, how do I win the argument? And we want to guard ourselves from that. I think that would be human wisdom. And then there's also, I think, a fear, that rational people have of like, I want to make sure I understand reality correctly. I don't want to wake up one day and realize that my whole life was wrong. And so I do think there's a good search for like, am I understanding what's really true? But as you go down that worldview road and you understand who the creator is, you understand who you are in light of that creator, what becomes the practical responsibility each day is learning how to live that wisdom out. And that is quite simply described as submission to him. And, we could call it walking in the Spirit. We could call it obeying the word of God. We could call it fearing the Lord. You could, there's all these phrases in the word of God, seeking those things that are above. But all of that is the practical fruit of having a correct worldview, is learning to submit to him. And so I think that's our goal in that discussion next week. And so that's my encouragement that's what I hopefully try to do each day. That's what we try to do each day, but encourage one another and let us be encouraged by the word of God to, if that is reality, that we are created beings by this creator, let us today commit again to walking with him in newness of life. So thank you guys for listening to this week's episode of the Thinklings podcast, and we will see you next week. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Thinklings podcast. We would love to hear from you. If you have any feedback, suggestions, or potential topics that you'd like us to discuss, you can contact us through our email, thinklingspodcast@gmail.com. Remember, don't let this conversation end with this podcast. Read good books, talk about them with your friends, and always continue to cultivate your mind. See you next time on the Thinklings podcast. The Thinklings want to remind our listeners that the Thinklings podcast is our personal production. Our conversations, book discussions, and viewpoints may not represent the views of Faith Baptist Bible College and Theological Seminary. Any questions or feedback should be directed to us at the Thinklings podcast.